I want to bring in Paul Conway. And Paul, you were Chief of Staff at the Department of Homeland Security, so just how big of a threat is this?
Well, actually, I was one of several chiefs there. It's a huge threat when you take a look at it, and that's why, in terms of the process, when this came out on Friday, you saw that immediately the president took action, impaneled a meeting of the National Security Council. On there, you have Tom Bossert, who's a veteran of many White House processes before, and the Department of Homeland Security under President Bush, with also General Kelly. And you're taking a look at this across every sector. So one of the most prominent sectors that got reported out on Friday was the healthcare sector. But as former Director of National Intelligence Clapper said, you got to wait till Monday and wait a couple of days after initial reports to see what the impact is. I think the impact on this is going to be significant, not just to providers in the healthcare field, but also to other financial institutions.
Paul, do you get a sense, and this is what I tried to articulate earlier in the show, that because in this particular case, the ransomware, they were asking for only $300 to $600, which is a whole lot less, in my mind, than paying FireEye or someone to come into your company and retrofit your stuff. And to me, as long as they keep paying out, and they are, particularly hospitals, they're paying out this money, we'll never see a true, honest move to keep our information safe, to keep our information away from these guys. And ultimately, that sets us up for the worst-case scenario, because there's going to be something a lot worse than what we saw this weekend.
Well, I tell you what, I think there's the short-term issue and the longer-term issue. In the short-term issue, you're absolutely right. The issue with hospitals is significant. Last year alone, out in Los Angeles, you had a hospital that paid over $17,000 for ransomware in Bitcoin to get the information back, and you had critical care patients that were potentially impacted. When you see that threshold, a low-dollar threshold, I think the first question you have to ask is, what's being done here? Is it a test of a much larger type of attack where you can get a threshold amount in there where people say, fine, I'll just go ahead and pay it, and they won't take it seriously. But each time you pay that, you're actually encouraging more activity on it. And that's why you got to be diligent about it. Long term, what you have to do is you have to make certain that those who are in the marketplace and government backing them up have taken the time and the investment in the systems to protect them.
Yeah, operative word there is the investment. I think a lot of corporations want government to do it. A lot of government wants corporations to do it. I want to go to the markets, because right now, in fact, they seem to be shrugging off all the noise in Washington, whether it's the Comey firing, the Russian probe, whatever it is. Instead, investors are focusing on all of the positive. And by the way, there are a lot of positive signals in this economy, especially in the job market, Paul.
Yeah, I tell you what, if you take a look at construction and manufacturing, and you put that in the context of where the president has said he wants to go on infrastructure investment, I think you've seen some very positive signals actually before executive action takes place. So just the sense coming off the campaign that there's going to be a significant change in taxes, there's going to be a significant change in terms of permitting process, environmental review. I think the optimism is building, and thus people will start building their workforces and the talent pipeline. I think it's fundamentally important to get some successes on the scoreboard here for the president and for the executive branch, so that when they're dealing with the Congress, you have a more interested Congress and more invested Congress in trying to get to the outcome here of more infrastructure.
But one thing we are learning, I mean, we've gone through 91% of earnings in this earnings period, 75% beats, 13.5% above, year over year. This is the best quarter since going back to, I think, 2011. I have a sense that success not only begets success, but the idea that ultimately the Trump agenda will go through is enough for now to drive at least the beginnings of investment and the sort of enthusiasm that goes from that so-called soft data more and more to so-called hard data.
I fully agree with you. Look, here's what we've made the departure from. I think if you look over the past 8 years, and not being partisan here, but let's be philosophical. I think when the economy was down and you had a government, an executive branch under President Obama that was trying heavily to regulate things through EPA and other things like that, there was no sense of optimism or breaking through if you were an investor or in the private sector trying to develop more manufacturing jobs and things like that. Now you have clearly a philosophical distinction on the table, which is I will take this federal government, I will charge my cabinet with the role of deregulating and clearing out the brush. And I think when people see that, they have greater encouragement to take the risk. Now, here's where the rub is. You have to get the policy in place, and you have to drive your team, if you're the president, and you have to drive that cabinet to make it happen. You're already starting to see some of that progress in areas like EPA, Secretary of Transportation Chow, other places like that.
Right. Now speaking of being driven, China. spending $1.4 trillion. That's with the T. They're going to build roads. They're going to burrow through jungles. They're going to establish rails throughout Asia, Africa, Europe. It's a reverse of Marco Polo's thing, the new Silk Road. Paul, I think we keep underestimating China, and it also I find it particularly interesting at this time where a lot of Americans are rejecting globalism, where the so-called communist China is embracing it. I mean, can this be the beginning of them ultimately being the world's top economy?
Well, I tell you what, I think President Xi is a dedicated communist. There's no doubt about that. And he's harboring private sector and especially other people's capital to advance his national mission. And so if people become wealthy by it or people spread commerce, that's fine. But geopolitically, they have a very definitive political objective, a very definitive military objective, and their economic objective, I think, is to surpass the United States in the West. Understanding that, they're building out their strategy. How transparent will it be? How will people trust it in terms of their national sovereignty when the Chinese start developing in places like this remains a question. And I think that the U.S. needs to get a more competitive standing, and people need to understand that what the president committed to and what resonated with Americans is this. We are a fundamentally different type of country. We represent a different belief system, and our capitalistic principles and private property principles should resonate equally around the world. We need to put some energy behind that. Right. The Chinese certainly have.
And by the same token, last week I thought it was amazing when Wilbur Ross talked about actually expanding trade rather than a trade war. I would love to see us use our might and our leverage to force open markets rather than to force middle-income Americans to pay more for TVs here.
Absolutely. Free markets, free people. And so I think when you have people like Secretary Chow, Secretary Ross, and the president committed to this and an economic team that is very focused on it, I think it's great for us. But make no doubt about it, the Chinese have multiple aims with their plan, and they're trying to reposition themselves internationally, not just to represent their economy and export goods, but really to export their belief system as an alternative to the American and Western belief system.
All right, Paul, thank you very much.